Could I have everyone's attention, please? I'm sorry to interrupt. It looks like every table's having a wonderful conversation, and I'm very sorry to interrupt that. But we do have a program, and I want to give our guests adequate time to make their presentations, and want to give you all adequate time to ask questions. And we are aiming to finish this up by 2 o'clock. So thank you very much. So please continue eating. That would be wonderful. I wanted to start by thanking the National Cherry Blossom Festival for including this event in their official program. At Sasakawa, we felt it was very important to have a intellectually stimulating event as part of the festivities for the Cherry Blossom Festival, and we're very grateful to the Cherry Blossom Festival. I also want to thank Dr. Steinberg, who is a Cosmos Club member and is our host today, so thank you very much, Dr. Steinberg, for hosting us. And also, I wanted to thank all of you for coming, because I know you're all busy and have a lot of choices, and it's wonderful to see that there's so many people here in Washington interested in Africa and how the United States and Japan might work together to promote our common interests and common values in Africa. Just briefly, a word about Sasakawa, because some of you may not be familiar. We are a US-based nonprofit, a 501c3, whose mission is to promote stronger relations between the United States and Japan, and to promote mutual understanding of Japan in the United States by providing information to interested Americans about Japan. If you're interested, I invite you to visit our website. We have a lot of publications which are all available for free on the website. We also have a Facebook page and a Twitter feed. If you're interested in following us, please feel free to do that. This today marks the first event in a new series that we're sponsoring called Views of Japan, and we chose Africa as the first place to look at and see how people in Africa are looking at Japan and the United States. But in the future, we plan to introduce views of Japan from other regions of the world as well. But I think it's very appropriate that we chose Africa first, because both Japan and the United States have tremendous common interests. Just by way of background, I was a United States ambassador to Senegal until January, and many of the objectives we had, promoting democratic values, promoting regional peace and security, sustainable, inclusive economic development. These were all values that were shared by our colleagues from the Japanese government, and we had a very close collaboration with Japan to promote those common values. So I'm really excited to have this event today. So without further ado, I'm not going to talk much because we have wonderful speakers here, but let me introduce our speakers, and maybe if I could ask the speakers to come and sit up on the stage so people can see you as I'm introducing you, that would be wonderful. Yes, so please. So first of all, we have Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who, among other accomplishments, she was my boss until I retired from the State Department in January, because she was the Assistant Secretary. Oh, please sit down. She was the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs at the State Department, and prior to that service, she was the Director General of the State Department, involved in all of the human resources decisions from the State Department. And next to her left, we have the Honorable Takashi Kitahara, who was Japan's ambassador to Senegal and a good colleague and friend who we worked together very closely on a range of issues. But he, in addition to was in Senegal, he also was responsible for Japan's relations with the Gambia, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. So I only had 2 countries to deal with, and he had 4, so he was twice as busy as I was in Senegal. And in addition to his experience in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, Ambassador Kitahara was a businessman for many years, and he worked for Mitsui Trading Company both in Paris and London. And he speaks excellent English, but his French is even more impressive. Whenever I heard him speaking French, I thought I was talking to someone from Paris we were very glad to have him coming all the way from Tokyo today to talk about Japan's views on Africa. And then to his left, we have Dr. Peter Pham, who's the Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives and the Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And thank you very much for coming today. And then to his left, we have Dr. Ruth Onyango, who is the chairperson of the Sasakawa Africa Association and the editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Food, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Development. She has come all the way from Nairobi to speak with us. She arrived yesterday and is leaving this afternoon, so we very much appreciate the effort you've made to come and share your insights with us. And finally, to the far left, we have His Excellence Carlos dos Santos, who is the ambassador of the Republic of Mozambique to the United States. Thank you very much for coming as well. So I'm just going to step up on the stage, and then we can get started. I think the first speaker will be, I almost said Assistant Secretary, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield. Thank you.
Good. Would you like me there, or should I do it from here? Okay. Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor for me to be here, and when Ambassador Zumwalt called to ask me to do this, I was really delighted to participate in this Sasakawa, this first event. I've been told I'm going to kick off things to talk a bit about the current state of play in Africa and some of the challenges facing the continent, and underlying all of this, the U.S. partnership with Japan in Africa. So let me just give you kind of a broad scene setter. The headlines, as you know, those of you who read about Africa tend to be focused on crises. You hear about the global health threats, you hear about famine, the terrorist threats that plague Africa. Poverty is what's in the headlines, but there's a different story to tell about Africa, and that's the story of opportunity, a surging youth population in some of the world's fastest growing economies, despite the fact that we've seen a global downturn. Many African countries continue to thrive. Africa is not a country, and I think most of you in the room know that, but there's a tendency to compare Africa to the United States or Africa to individual countries in Europe. Africa is a continent with 54 different countries, and it's an extraordinarily diverse continent. It's a continent that's filled with opportunity and promise. There are tremendous natural resources and human resources, a population of about 1.2 billion people, rapidly expanding middle class, and as I mentioned, a huge youth bulge. It's also a continent that has made remarkable progress despite all of the challenges, which I'll expand on later in my remarks. Many African countries have had successful democratic elections. Again, these tend not to make the news. Nigeria's presidential election in 2015 was a tremendous success and served as a model across the continent. More recently, elections in Ghana and the Gambia, which was marked by a 22-year dictatorship. These elections, again, have really put Africa on the map as a continent moving toward democratic norms. And while formidable, the democratic transitions that have taken place have had positive impact on millions of Africans across the continent. On the health front, 40 years ago, life expectancy in Africa was about 47 years. Now it's 60. The child mortality rate has dropped 52% between 1990 and 2015, and the maternal mortality rate has fallen 49%. An AIDS-free generation and a polio-free Africa are actually within reach, but epidemics, of course, continue, such as Ebola, and these have really tested the health infrastructure across the continent. In education, sub-Saharan Africa has made greater improvements in access to education since 1990 than any other region of the world. The proportion of children enrolled in primary or secondary school has risen to 54% over the past 25 years. Again, beyond the primary level, there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. In large part because of the progress that Africa has made in these critical areas, Africa cannot be ignored on the global stage. The world is taking notice of the continent. There's an explosion of investments on the continent of Africa, a recognition that, particularly by the private sector, that there's money to be made on the continent of Africa, and there are lots of opportunities for the private sector. But no one can deny that despite the progress that we're seeing, Africa faces some major challenges, and I'll focus on 5 of the key ones, and clearly these are not comprehensive. There are many that could be added to my list, but these are the 5 that I think are key. And overcoming these central challenges is what the U.S. partnership with Africa is all about. First, at the top of the list of challenges is Africa's youth bulge. You will note that I mentioned the youth bulge as an opportunity earlier in my remarks, and it is an opportunity, but if not dealt with, it can continue to be a challenge. Africa's population is projected to double to 2 billion people by 2050, and half of the population today is under the age of 19. Half under the age of 19. The challenge is to create opportunities for Africa's youth, and that means creating jobs. It also means creating educational opportunities and educational systems that will prepare these young people for the future, because we believe that education is the foundation of growth, and countries need to invest more in education, including primary education, particularly for young girls, because while we have seen an increase in the number of children in primary school, girls tend to drop out at that level. Weak education means weak opportunity, and without opportunity, youth becomes susceptible to extremist ideologies, to radicalization, and to criminality, and that's what we want to avoid. I strongly believe if Africa is to prosper, it has to invest in its youth. Youth are their single greatest resource, and they can either be a force for good or they can be a force for bad. And if Africa's youth are engaged and they're contributing to their countries, Africa's economies will grow and its people will prosper, and we think stability will be the order of the day across the continent. The second challenge that I see is boosting Africa's economic growth. While Africa's long-term economic trends are favorable, economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa decelerated sharply from 3.4% in 2015 to about 1.6% in 2016, due in large part to the declining commodity prices. So improving the growth rate and diversifying Africa's economies will depend on encouraging more investment in Africa. And it's business that we know that will create jobs and create opportunities in Africa, not governments. And so we have to educate companies about the opportunities that are there for them to invest in on the continent. The third challenge is democratic governance. Democratic governance, as well as trying to provide capacity for governments to provide for their people. We know that democracy can succeed in Africa, and we've seen substantial progress. I mentioned Nigeria and Ghana and Gambia, but there are dozens of other really great democratic elections and transitions that have taken place on the continent of Africa. But we also know that far too often, African leaders cling to power, and we know who they are. They don't need to be named. True leaders have the courage to hand over power, and when leaders refuse to prepare for transition, sooner or later, instability, if not outright civil war, is the result of that. So ultimately, this is about the will of the African people. An Afrobarometer survey last year indicated that more than 2/3 of Africans say that democracy is preferable to any other form of government, and a survey in 2015 indicated that 3/4 support term limits. So Africans want democracy, and it's something that we, as the United States, working with our partners, including Japan, have worked to provide capacity to assist them in. The fourth challenge in my list of challenges, of course, is ending conflict and countering terrorism. Solving the security piece of the puzzle is crucial, and without peace and security, you can't have democracy, and you can't have prosperity, and you cannot have opportunity. Conflict destabilizes states and borders and stifles economic growth. It robs young Africans of the opportunity for education and for a better way of life. So we have to continue to work with our partners across Africa to do things like in the devastating civil war in South Sudan, which has led to an entirely man-made famine. Boko Haram continues to tear apart local communities in Nigeria and the greater Lake Chad Basin areas. Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and other terrorist groups continue to undermine the stability that countries throughout the continent seek. African countries, working with the African Union, have been taking a leading role in trying to address the insecurity issues across the continent, but certainly they need partners such as us. We know that the long-term solution to ending violence, however, will depend on addressing the root causes of conflict, which include poor governance, weak institutions and economies, poverty, and the lack of opportunity. And this is the work that the United States and the international community must continue to be engaged in. Finally, a fifth challenge is meeting humanitarian needs throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And as I was reading the Sasakawa description, that is one of the areas that they have worked on very successfully. But due to conflict and drought, or both, millions are at risk of starvations in different parts of the continent. We know that a famine has been declared in parts of South Sudan. Other African countries, such as Nigeria and Somalia, face significant risk of famine as well. A key part of the long-term solution is building the capacity of governments and civil society to address these critical humanitarian issues. But in the meantime, we must work with the international community and other donors to provide humanitarian assistance. If I could just touch a bit on the U.S.-Japan partnership, I know that the ambassador will expand on that. We have worked very, very closely with the Japanese government to help to work together to resolve some of these issues. But the challenges that Africa faces cannot be solved by any single country alone. It cannot be solved by Africans themselves, and the success depends on a strong partnership with the international community, and it depends on countries working together to tackle these challenges. And that is what we have done in our regular consultations with the Japanese government on Africa, as well as consultations with other parts of the world. I will end there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Linda. Ambassador Kitahara.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, to be invited here at this magnificent club. And but as you might see, Ambassador Zumwalt has made a huge list of questions for me. And in 15 minutes, I think it is almost impossible to reply to everything. So today, I think first I will explain about the very basic view on how the Japanese government recognizes Africa of today. And this will be part of why Africa today. And then I will try to explain what is the Japanese diplomatic policy to Africa, what actually the Japanese government wants to do in Africa, what they want to achieve, and why. And then at the end, I will try to touch a little bit upon the TICAD process. So as introduced by Ambassador Zumwalt, although I spent 3.5 years in Senegal as the Japanese ambassador there, actually I spent 39 years in the private sector in a company named Mitsui, and I had a lot of experience to go to the African countries for business. And so it's not so easy for me to talk on behalf of the government. And in that sense, I'm very glad that my colleague, Minister Suzuki, is here, so that if I say something wrong, he can send a message to me to correct what I'm saying. But anyhow, let me start with the basic, very, very basic view on how the government sees Africa. First, I guess we recognize the presence of the continent by its huge scale. The large land area, 3 times the the United States of America, the increasing population, which will reach over 2 billion in 2050, and the number of countries, more than 54 countries, who altogether has a big impact or influence in the international community. So those scale or the dimensions, we see it very important. Everything's actually quite different from my country. And second point is the fast-growing economy. Of course, in the past few years, it has increased by 5 years a year for many years, and it attracts many countries and many private countries, and many countries. Sorry, and there's a high potential, not only for the rich national resources. For those, I think every country, the world, has been looking at the natural resources since more than 50 years ago. And actually, my first visit to African continent goes back to 1973 when I visited the country Burkina Faso, but at the time it was Haute-Volta. I was trying to develop a mine of manganese ore. So the natural resources, actually, everybody was looking since many years. But now what's different is that there are more and more big infrastructure projects, like the construction of power generations, road, buildings, seaport, airport, and a lot of information and communication technology related industries. And so and today there are also many companies, private companies, who tries to produce their own product in Africa to make it a basis for export. So on top of these factors, now we see also the positive support from the international donors or from the other emerging countries, which makes Africa a continent of opportunity and hope, and an important partner politically and economically. So everything make it a frontier where actually countries and companies are competing very hard. Now, this being said, on the other hand, there are still a lot of issues to be resolved. Of course, there are a lot of still political confusions, armed conflicts, which needs for peace and stability, and a lot of poverty, the gap between the rich and the poor becoming more and more big, health problem, basic education, food, delay in achieving the MDGs, and there are serious, really, problems which needs to be addressed. And not to forget about the increasing threat of terrorism, violent extremism, radicalization from Maghreb, Northern Africa to Sahel, which continues to Somalia. So these are really big issues, and these are not only African issues, those might be the factor of the global unstableness, and therefore we strongly believe that the whole international community should be part of this resolution, and we, Japan, would be the front runner to tackle with those problems. And now, based on those views, I would like to just explain the Japanese diplomatic policy on Africa. I think there are 4 pillars, four areas. But basically, we believe that the reinforcement of our commitment to Africa will directly benefit our country itself. I'm going to explain. Our commitment or engagement to Africa in every aspect will strengthen and enlarge the capacity of our diplomacy, because to have the consensus of the 54 countries or get their support will be very helpful in promoting or try to make progress in the international issues, global scale issues like the environment, or in the securing the international elections for Japan, or everything related to the resolution in the United Nations of Security Council, and of course including and especially the reform itself of the United Nations Security Council. So we have to be very active and proactive and try to contribute to Africa in order to get the support and cooperation from Africa. And this is a very important political aspect. Now, the second point is the economy. I already touched about the economy, so I won't be long for this, but nobody can neglect today the rich natural resources or the fast-growing economy and increasing middle-class people. And there are also already many Japanese private companies showing interest, and there's a lot of potentials. And we can not only get those natural resources or get a big infrastructure project, but I think we can help, we can contribute to the African economy by supplying our technology or the way of doing business, like it's the case for Toyota, you know, the just-in-time system or 5S system. And so we believe we can be of the win-win situation. But at this point, the government is very active, very aggressive to try to sell the Japanese economy to African countries. But for me, who spent 40 years in the private sector, actually it's not so easy, you know. It's not that if the government just says, oh, you, private sector, you have to go to Africa, that everybody will follow. No, that will never be the case. So this is something that has to be very worked out very closely between the government and the private sector, because the situation changed in every country in Africa. There are 54 countries. The language is different, culture is different, everything is different. So we cannot talk about Africa in a single word. We have to look at each area, each country. So economy is not so easy, might not be easy as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs might be thinking of. Third point, we have a lot of humanitarian aid to the African countries. And we firmly believe that it is our duty and our obligation to help those countries in the many difficult situations they are facing from time to time. And this is our duty as one of the leading, if I might say, country in the international community. And this will also lead us to get confidence from other countries in the world. There are sometimes, I might guess, that there are countries who are dealing with African country, for instance, just to get what they want to get, but on the economic point of view. But we really want to improve the way of living of the African people, including, for instance, I personally believe Japan, and not only Japan, international community should do much more on the basic education, and I think important thing. But so anyhow, it is our duty to contribute to things, which as a result will get the confidence from the international community. And the last point is by doing all those contribution or experience, it will reinforce Japan's voice in the international community, especially when we talk with our partner countries on the development such as SDGs or human security. We can share our experience and achievement on what we've been doing in the past many years. And those are the 4 points which we believe by committing to the development, by committing to the Africa, it will be reinforce our basis of diplomacy. And to promote or to execute our strategy to the African continent, our core engine is the TICAD. So the TICAD process, and I think we have distributed the handouts. So the main point is in this paper, and I think I already almost passed the time, so I won't go into the real details, but just to explain that TICAD stands for Tokyo International Conference on African Development, and Japan launched this initiative in 1993. And this is a high-level dialogue between African leaders and development partners on issues facing Africa, such as the economic development, poverty, conflict, etc. And this has been held once every 5 years in Japan, always in Japan. But at the occasion of TICAD 5 held in 2013 in Tokyo, our African friends thought that 5 years interval was too long, and that why don't you organize the TICAD once on the continent of Africa? So we decided to shorten the interval and to 3 years. And because of that, the last TICAD was held last year in August for the first time on the continent of Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. And I won't explain about the paper that I have distributed, but I want to remind you that it has TICAD has a very few, some uniqueness, and the uniqueness of TICAD is written in the page 4. Actually, compared to other countries' similar conference, which is between the country and Africa, our TICAD is open and inclusive forum. So we are not only limited our conference to Japan and Africa. We have equal partners, which are United Nations, UNDP, AU, and the World Bank. And we have engagement of multiple stakeholders, alignment with Africans' own agenda, and we have very effective implementation with integrated follow-up mechanisms. So after the TICAD summit, we have the follow-up meetings, and this is somehow a little bit different from others. And last August, we had, of course, our Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to Nairobi, but we have a participation of 54 African countries, all of them, 52 other partnership countries, 74 international and regional organizations, and representative of the private sector and civil society organization from various parts of the world. So this was a ticket, and we had 3 priority areas that we agreed upon. Pillar 1 was promoting structural economic transformation through economic diversification and industrialization. Pillar 2, promoting resilient health system for quality life. And the last one was promoting social stability for shared prosperity. So I stop here with my time, and I will be pleased to respond to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Dr. Fong.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zumwalt, and thank you to the Sasakawa Foundation, not only for organizing this event today in this beautiful setting on this beautiful day in the middle of the Cherry Blossom Festival, but also giving highlight to not only Japan's contributions to Africa, but I think some of the opportunities to triangulate that with the United States. Picking up where Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Ambassador Kitara left us, my brief is to talk a little bit about U.S. policy and then to comment perhaps on how U.S. views Japan's engagement in Africa. If we look at U.S. engagement in Africa, certainly going back to the establishment, the creation of our country, engagement that has a tragic dimension to it, we have to be honest and acknowledge that the African diaspora we thought in our country, many arrived here involuntarily, and that was a dark moment in our nation's history. But there are brighter moments. Interestingly, people forget that the first military engagement on a permanent basis of the young United States Navy was the West Africa Squadron, which the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, 1842, obliged the U.S. to keep 72 guns at all times off the west coast of Africa to help repress the transatlantic slave trade. But moving more to the modern time, U.S. engagement with Africa in modern times certainly began in the independence period. The U.S. encouraged after World War II our partners in Europe to relinquish their colonies to grant independence and move very quickly to establish diplomatic relations with all the newly independent countries. The State Department's Africa Bureau next year will celebrate its 60th anniversary, having been established in 1958 after then Vice President Richard Nixon's trip to a number of newly independent African countries. And Ambassador Thomas Greenfield is the 17th in a line of assistant secretaries going back to that time, so consistent ties politically to Africa. In 1961, the U.S. established the U.S. Agency for International Development, which interestingly comes several years before our British friends established what is now the DFID, and some of our other partners established agencies for international assistance, so since 1961. And what I think is worth noting during this period is throughout this whole history in the modern period, there's been a large bipartisan consensus. We have our differences in politics here in this country, sometimes very bitter differences, but by and large, Africa has largely escaped that rancor. If one looks 2 years ago to the renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, large bipartisan margins in both houses of Congress. One always can single out and count literally with one hand, at least on the Senate side, the people who voted no against that renewal. And modern programs that enjoyed, more recent programs that enjoyed great bipartisan support. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, established under President George W. Bush, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, again, wide bipartisan support for both. And then just 2 years ago, the first ever U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, which was a signature accomplishment of Ambassador Thomas Greenfield's tenure as Assistant Secretary, the largest ever gathering of African leaders, almost 50 heads of state and government gathered in Washington, along with business leaders to discuss U.S.-Africa ties and strengthening. If we look at this picture, this history of consistent engagement across administrations of both parties, administrations come and go, emphases change, but one can distinguish, I would argue, three main themes, interests, if you want to call them that. I was schooled in the realist tradition of Hans Morgenthau. I like to talk about interests. Other people might want to talk about objectives. The 2012 U.S. strategy for sub-Saharan Africa put out by the last administration talked about 4 pillars, but I'd like to enumerate 3 of them. One is certainly the one that underlies and makes possible everything else, security and stability. But security and stability, in my view, is not simply security in terms of hard security against some of the threats that Ambassador Thomas Greenfield has mentioned, including radical extremist groups and others, but also human security, and that's the basis for stability. And stability in Africa means governments that are first and foremost legitimate in the eyes of their people, and that legitimacy is founded upon delivery of governance, and of course, oftentimes, but not necessarily exclusively, that legitimacy and governance is founded upon democratic choice of the people. And Ambassador Thomas Greenfield pointed out some of the recent successes, big and small, most recently the Gambia, but also in Nigeria 2 years ago, of democratic transitions that have occurred. Of course, there's a long way to go, and there are any number of places where that's not happening. If these are that's security. Second pillar, I would say, is spurring economic growth, and that includes trade and investment opportunities for Africa's partners in a win-win combination. And the third major interest, I would say, is, and it goes without saying, but it also should be articulated and acknowledged, there is a geopolitical interest. Africa is home to 54 states, 54 very different states. It's a major influence in international organizations and other bodies as well. So 3 core interests of the United States. Now, pivoting a little bit, how do we look at what Japan is doing, given these are our interests as the United States? The ambassador described Japan's development policy in great detail, and especially the TCAD process. And I just want to highlight a few things about TCAD, and they mentioned the other aspect of Japanese engagement, which perhaps doesn't get as much attention and probably deserves more attention in Washington, which is the security aspect of the engagement. But just a few comments on the TCAD process, going back all these years. I would say the point that the ambassador brought up, which I think is very important, is that it's an open process. Since TCAD 2, 1998, had more than 80 countries involved, 51 African, 11 Asian, and 18 North American and European countries, plus other multilateral organizations. So it's been an open process. It's a forum, not a donors conference. And I think that's an important aspect to highlight. The promises made at TCAD. In TCAD 4, 2008, then Prime Minister Fukada pledged the doubling of Japan's official development assistance to certain priority areas, including economic growth, human security, at that time the MDGs, and addressing environmental issues. At TCAD 5 in 2013, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe announced an additional $14 billion to ODA, plus important aspect, recognition that the private sector drives economic growth and prosperity, $32 billion in public-private investments to support growth. And the ambassador mentioned TCAD 6 last year and its 3 pillars. What are the takeaways from the Japanese engagement, at least from an American perspective looking at it? I would say there are probably four. First, I've already mentioned that it's a process that's a forum, it's an open forum, rather than simply a conference or a bilateral. The second part, I think, is very unique in this process, and maybe something that a lesson learned, is the flexibility built into this mechanism. Although all of Japan, as far as I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, all of Japan's ODA towards Africa is formulated utilizing the TCAD guidelines. There's more to it than just the ODA, because ODA doesn't necessarily fit entirely into the flexibility, the pragmatism built into the model. Third lesson is it's a whole of government approach. It isn't just driven by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also other ministries, finance, education, culture, science and technology, agriculture, and other ministries involved. And I think the fourth lesson kind of to take away is the lesson that African development challenges are genuinely global and need to be addressed by the international community as a whole. That for the development contribution. I think a word needs to be said about Japan's very important and I think under-recognized security contribution. Japan carries out an important anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden. Ever since the chemical tanker Golden Nori was seized by Somali pirates in 2007, Japan has had a small facility, base, if you will, the first since the Second World War, in Djibouti, not far from Camp Lemonnier, the headquarters of the U.S. Combined Joint Task Force, Horn of Africa. And the Japanese self-defense forces fly P-3C aircraft patrolling the internationally recognized transit corridor through the Gulf of Aden, helping provide security for that vital artery. And Japan has also participated and contributed to numerous UN peacekeeping operations over the years, going back to a very modest start in 1992, and I see my friend Tony Carroll is here, sending 2 election observers to UNAVEM 2, the monitoring the elections, the democratic transition in Angola, but also to Ambassador Dos Santos' country in 93, 94, sending 68 staff officers and election observers to UNAMOS in Mozambique. 400 troops sent in 94 to Rwanda to assist with Rwandan refugee relief. 2006, election observers to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Since 2008 to 2011, staff officers to Sudan's for UNMISS, the UNMISS with one S, in the period leading up to the referendum and the independence of South Sudan. And since the 2011 missions to UNMISS with 2 S's, the United Nations mission in South Sudan, varying in times, the most recent deployment, some 350 troops, engaging engineers, building the infrastructure for a country that, at the moment of its independence, didn't yet quite have a road connecting its capital to any borders of any neighboring states. So great contribution over the years to peacekeeping. So let me wrap up by asking the question of, given these contributions to development and to security, given the 3 pillars as I've articulated them of U.S. core interests in Africa, let me leave just 2 recommendations for going forward. One is, obviously, for the United States and Japan. I know there have been strategic dialogues during Ambassador Thomas Greenfield's tenure at the head of the Africa Bureau, but integrate Africa engagement more into our bilateral U.S.-Japanese relationship. Discuss it more, highlight more, look for opportunities to triangulate. And let me single just one example that I do a lot of work in North Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. In Morocco, for the last more than almost a decade now, JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, has partnered with the National Office of Water and Electricity, ONE, in Morocco to train people in sanitation and water treatment for a number of sub-Saharan African countries, primarily in West Africa, but not exclusively. And I think that cadre, over the course of this time, several hundred people have been fully trained as part of this collaborative effort of Japan partnering with an African country and helping other African countries It's an example of a program that's very effective. It's effective because you're working with a partner that is locally, not only in Africa, but integrated a variety of economic and social and cultural ties, historic and political links to that part of Africa. It's also cost effective, something we should look at, and opportunities for triangulation. Second recommendation goes to both the United States and Japan. We still have this artificial line that we draw across the map of sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. That's been there as a bureaucratic line, not from the beginning of the Africa Bureau, but subsequently in the United States since the period of Henry Kissinger's tenure at the State Department. But it's a line that Africans reject. The African Union covers the entire continent as a whole. The example I chose there of Japan's engagement with using Morocco to get action in West Africa shows the linkages between North and South. And in our own country, given the United States, given the fact that our Defense Department organizes all of Africa into one area of responsibility, and since 20th of January, the National Security Council has organized itself in that way. Recommendation would be, in the future, looking at ways of treating Africa as a whole, as it itself views itself, not only for our government, but also for the Japanese government, and looking at it that way and dealing with it. I think we can look for some very effective and positive synergies. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very enlightening talk, and also for making some recommendations, which I'm sure will be useful for both governments. Dr. Onyango.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I guess I don't have to talk about Africa because everybody else here knows more about it than I do. Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Anytime I'm invited to talk about Africa, I make sure I take there myself, you know. So I was busy elsewhere, but I said I would arrive here yesterday and I'm leaving today. Not because I don't like the US. I was trained here. My university education was here. In fact, 45 years ago exactly, I gave birth to my twin daughters in Washington State, Baptist Hospital. So US is very special to me. And I've known a past United States which has reached out to Africa because Kenya, for example, we were colonized by the British. And we have this love-hate relationship with the UK, but when the US came, it was missionaries, it was education, it was people coming to study, and you know, a lot of staff in our government are actually US trained, and that's why our election system, our education system is mostly American. But I must say that a lot of that seems to be changing for whatever reason, that we are seeing not the kind of capacity building, support, sustain that was there before. I got introduced to Japanese when I joined Jomo Kenyatta University in Kenya. That is the biggest higher education project for the Japanese government. And we interacted with the Japanese. They would bring their experts to work with us on the faculties and so on. I then also visited Japan, and I saw a culture that is so different from other cultures. They don't talk about themselves. They don't say what they do. They're very soft diplomacy. They are more like partners. Even when Kenya was blacklisted, during the time we were being accused of corruption, you know, nobody wanted to hear about Kenya. Japan was there steadily working with us. You know, so they are there working with you, building a friendship that lasts for a long time. So I knew about them already, and I knew about JICA and the kind of work they do. So way back in 2010, 29, I was asked to join the SAA board, the Sasakawa Africa Association board. But I'd been doing some work with them because they were working with smallholder farmers. I'm in the food sector. I work with smallholder farmers, most of them women. I know who feeds the family. So I went out and I said, I'm going to support those who feed families, those who feed children, and that is the women of Africa. So that's where mostly my work is. So when I joined them in 2010, Dr. Borlaug, Norman Borlaug, who was one of the founders, a son of the US, died. And then by some miracle, I was made to replace him. So Sasakawa Africa Association was started way back in 1986, following the Ethiopian famine in 84, 85, which killed about 1 million Ethiopians. I remember that. It was so bad. There was so much outcry. Something is happening in Ethiopia. Nobody would listen. So there was a clip on BBC for 6 minutes. And late Roichi Sasakawa was sitting in Tokyo, and he saw it, and he called Dr. Borlaug and said, why are you seeing what's happening in Africa? Can we go to Africa? And Dr. Borlaug had never been to Africa. He already was 74. He had gotten his Nobel Prize for the work he did in Asia. He said, I'm not going to Africa. And so there are two stubborn men. And he called again, let's go to Africa. And Dr. Borlaug says, I'm too old. And Sasakawa says, but I'm 84 years old. I'm older than you. Let's go to Africa. So they agreed, and they took President Jimmy Carter. So you had a philanthropist, Mr. Sasakawa. You had a scientist, Dr. Borlaug, and then you had the political leverage, President Jimmy Carter. And the three of them founded this organization. And then they went to Africa. They wanted to get their headquarters in Nairobi. Nairobi, they didn't get very favorable reception, so they went and established the headquarters in Ethiopia, and that's where we are. So we have offices in Tokyo. We have regional offices in Ethiopia. We have worked in 15 countries, and now we work in 4 countries: Mali, northern Ethiopia, where there are problems with insecurity, Ethiopia itself, and then Uganda. But many of our successes have been where governance has been good, because they would go and then approach the head of state. Surely you want to feed your country. Surely you want to promote agriculture. Surely we don't want to see more famines. Surely you want your people to be better off economically. And so Ghana was a good success during President Rawlings' time. Ethiopia right now has never seen the kind of famine that they had before. In fact, the East African countries are now importing maize from Ethiopia. Collectively, they are importing maize from Ethiopia. And so where people take it very seriously, governments take this very seriously, it actually works. So since 1986, we've had the Nippon Foundation. Roichi Sasakawa died, his son Yohei took over, supporting our organization every single year to date, and we don't necessarily upscale. We work with the ministries of agriculture. We work with the people themselves. We demonstrate technologies, and then we say, can you upscale? So where extension is good, where public extension survives and thrives, it's actually a lot easier to get the technologies then passed on to the people. But for many of the 54 African countries, public extension does not exist. Public extension died during the structural adjustment days. So only Ethiopia has a proper public extension. The other ones are just struggling. They have different modes of extension. So in 1993, we started what we call Sasakawa Africa Fund for Extension Education, which takes already trained mid-level extension workers to upgrade them to the new technologies. And now we address the value chain. We try to bring in more women. We don't get enough women, because culturally, many times it's difficult to have male extension workers going to the women. And remember, it's mostly the women who are small-scale farmers. It's mostly the women who concentrate on food crops. And so it is very important that we do this balance. So that's where we are right now, and the way we do it, and I think what I've learned from this engagement is a culture. People will stay with you throughout until they begin to see some changes. And already we are seeing many smallholder farmers, and when I say small, I'm not talking of 50 acres like I see in the US or in Europe. I'm talking half acre, 1 acre, 2 acres, no more than 5 acres. And 3/4 of African farmers are still small scale. And it's not that we don't have land, there's a lot of land. Some of it being hijacked by other people, some of it being owned by the haves, and some of it just being put under wildlife. And so you have people actually going hungry, not because we don't have land. Land is there. And like Ambassador Linda talked about, now we have drought. 17 million people are facing famine. They have starved. Animals have starved. And so for me, what hurts me is that all this time, when I left this country going back, I was trained and I promised I would go back. I would go back to the continent. So many times you see 2 steps ahead and 10 steps backward. And what is going on? That we still see bad types of malnutrition, children dying, families hungry, and I attribute that just to lack of planning, bad governance. And I feel, when I travel to speak, I feel that the continent cannot be left unto itself. Yes, we are more educated people, but we have other challenges of too many young people who cause a threat if we don't actually address them, if we do not engage them, who want a better continent for themselves. And I feel that through partnerships, through sharing what this country has gone through sharing what Japan has gone through to be where it is, it's possible to get Africa to also go through what you have gone through and be at a better place. I just came back from Ethiopia, my favorite place right now, because I've been going to Ethiopia, seeing it dirty in the streets of Addis Ababa, too many beggars, hungry, to an Ethiopia which can now export food. And I'm not saying it's attributable just to us, but it's many things. But it's a government which said, we don't want to see that situation again on this continent, in our country. And then I just came back from Benin, a country we never really hear about. It had the elections last year. The president invited us to talk about what they should do in agriculture. It's only 10 million people. That is a country willing and ready to move on. So some of these countries which have good governance, like you have mentioned, which are taking their destiny in their own hands, they are ready to work with anyone to move forward. And I would just like to urge that your kind of diplomacy, which comes not just with money being wasted. Africa is not where it is for lack of money. It isn't. In my own country, money is given back to the treasury at the end of the fiscal year. When people are starving, it's not for lack of money. I think we need a different mode of disbursing the funds. We need a different way of tracking the funds to make sure that they go where they should. This is taxpayers' money. So you can't just be giving any government money and you are quoting huge sums of money. I have my own small NGO at the ground level. I reach about 500,000 people, most of them women. If I tell you the amount of money, I think the biggest investment is Ruth, it's me, my time. So if you use the funds we have properly, Ambassador, and you have been in Africa, you know who can be accountable. You know what people need is not too much to transform their lives. But so long as we continue disbursing the way we do, government to government, huge amounts, nothing being seen, then people sitting here say, but we give money. So why are we seeing these bad stories on TV? So I work at the ground level where one can make a difference, where a household can be seen to have moved from point A to point B. and you don't need a whole lot of funds to do that. And finally, just go and look for your people that have been trained in this country. We have a lot of Africans trained in the USA. We have a lot of Africans trained in Japan. And if you track them and say, how do we support them? Some universities do that. You will then begin to see some impact. Sorry, I can't say everything, but I just felt that I can come and share this with you. And thank you so much for being here. And if you are from the continent, thank you for being part of the mother continent, and that you'll always be there to support that continent. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Dos Santos.
Thank you very much. What can one say after such a wonderful statement? Allow me to begin by thanking the co-organizers of this event for inviting me to represent the views of Africa, African governments, and also for having a discussion, a serious discussion about African issues here in Washington, D.C. It doesn't happen often, and we don't take it for granted. So we appreciate the opportunity. Of course, it's a great honor for me to be part of this panel, such a distinguished panel, very much like-minded. So some of the things I'll say will have been said in different ways, but I'm supposed to present the African perspective. And I have prepared notes to speak more about our impressions on TICAD. On a personal note, I've been associated with TICAD since the 1990s, mid-1990s, just a few years after it was established, because I was permanent representative of Mozambique to the United Nations, and the then permanent representative of Japan to the UN, Ambassador Isaichi Owada, distinguished Japanese, who is now in The Hague as a judge, used to hold workshops and seminars and dinners, luncheons in New York and Japan, and he took us to Japan to talk about these issues. So when we see the concepts of ownership, the concepts of partnership enshrined in what TICAD is today, we remember those days that Japan consulted Africans on what this initiative, great initiative that they had, was supposed to be. And very often we don't have that opportunity. We decide on programs and projects for Africa, but we don't consult them about them. We think they are good for them, we don't ask them how good they are, and sometimes very well meant, but we need to consult Africans, and we find that in TICAD. And this is probably the reason why Africans adhere almost unanimously to TICAD, and they attend at the highest level possible to all meetings of TICAD. And they follow the recommendations, and they interact with the conveners, with the co-organizers to work on TICAD. I can safely say that TICAD will help us build the Africa we want. And this is a quote from the AU's 2063 agenda. So the question of how do African countries assess Japan's humanitarian, economic, and security contributions, I would answer that we make a very positive assessment. TICAD's impact is equally positive because it allowed us to focus on specific areas of common interest and to devise joint strategies for appropriate action. We have gone from political and economic reforms, private sector development, regional cooperation and integration, emulating the achievements of Asian countries in TICAD 1, to an agenda for action, support for NEPAD, to identifying areas of priority action in economic growth, human security, MDGs, consolidating peace and good governance. We have also looked at how to build environmental and climate change governance, and how to have a robust and sustainable economy, inclusive and resilient societies, peace and stability. And more recently in TICAD 6 in Nairobi, an emphasis was placed on such important issues as quality of infrastructure and healthcare systems. In order to illustrate the action-oriented framework of TICAD, I would like to take a few moments to talk about the example that I know best, which is my country, Mozambique. Japan and Mozambique celebrate 40 years of diplomatic relations, which have grown significantly in terms of the bilateral cooperation in recent years. Japan, as it has been said, Peter mentioned this, has contributed significantly to the restoration of peace in the country following the 1992 peace agreement. We understand it was the first time that Japan dispatched self-defense forces personnel to the UN peacekeeping operation in Mozambique, which is something we appreciate and we continue to cherish. We also have an agreement on reciprocal liberalization, promotion, and protection of investment, which we are told is the first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa, but it has a great potential to be replicated throughout Africa. The Prime Minister of Japan was in Mozambique on an official visit in January 2014, and the President of Mozambique was in Japan last month of March. The two leaders not only reiterated the importance of TICAD and its impact on development in Africa in general and Mozambique in particular, but also recognized it has an open, as it has been said here, transparent and inclusive forum to address common challenges in Africa. They reaffirmed their commitment to further strengthen relations based on universal values of democracy, the rule of law, and good governance. They agreed on a new bilateral partnership they chose to call Amizade, which in Portuguese means friendship. The Japanese Prime Minister reiterated the commitment to support infrastructure and human resources development, capacity building for 1,000 Mozambicans in the next 5 years, as well as assisting in formulating strategic master plans through official development assistance projects and by promoting investments by Japanese companies. And I must say that a number of Japanese companies are already active in Mozambique, including Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, just to name a few. And I should also add here that Japan is supporting Mozambique to create an enabling environment for investment. One of the results of that is a beautiful brochure that gives the profile of the country, of the different provinces, and you can see here the Center for Promotion of Investment and JICA. They produced this brochure together as part of the overall support that Japan is giving to Mozambique to enable investments instead of just complaining that things are not working well. They are supporting us to do better. And of course, Japan is also assisting in building high-quality infrastructure in Mozambique to service not only the internal needs of the country, but also the countries of the region through the Nacala Corridor Economic Development Strategy, which includes railways, ports, and airports, and the same corridor and beyond, we also have transport and communications, energy, roads, bridges, agriculture, and maritime issues. All these issues are supported by Japan, and we work in partnership. Last year, Mozambique hosted the High Quality Infrastructure Conference in Maputo, which was co-organized with Japan and the TICAD. High quality infrastructure combined with capacity building will make development sustainable, and we believe in that. And Mozambique has also offered to host the ministerial follow-up meeting of TICAD 4 later this year. This shows how committed we are to the TICAD process. On the question of Japan's US comparative advantages in terms of its collaboration with Africa, its partnership with Africa, I would say that both countries, Japan and US, share basic principles and values of good governance, the rule of law, democracy, and protection of human rights, as we have heard here from my predecessors. There are differences in the ways cooperation and development assistance are approached, but there are also synergies which could be emulated. For instance, on the differences, I would say that US provides infrastructure development support through MCC, which has a specific set of conditions and a scorecard for countries to qualify. Japan provides similar assistance to infrastructure development within the context of TICAD, which we have just discussed. Where I see synergies developing could be, for example, in the health sector, in which the US, through PEPFAR, the Center for Disease Control and other US agencies, has done a great deal in building and supporting health systems in a number of African countries, including Mozambique, together with local institutions. In the follow-up to TICAD 6, those experiences could certainly be emulated, combining with Japan's own experiences. The fundamental prerequisite is that all partners must be willing to collaborate for the common goal and common good. To be successful, Japan and US partnerships in Africa in Africa and with Africa, there should be a change of mindset. They should all be equal partners with a common goal, working together in support of Africa's agenda, and not see Africa as a junior partner who needs to be lectured or coerced into adhering to universal principles which are already enshrined in the African Union Constitutive Act and NEPAD, the principles of good political, economic and corporate governance, democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights and freedoms. Recent developments provide ample evidence that all societies face challenges in effectively realizing the full potential and aspirations of their citizenry, and that democracy is an ongoing concern in need of constant improvement. Another aspect which I consider important in the partnership we seek to build is the importance of not confusing administrative incapacities with lack of political will. Often in African countries, the realization of a vision and implementation of adopted policies, plans, and programs are impaired by weak capacities and sheer incompetence of some civil servants or even senior officials, and even in the private sector. Instead of electing to punish in the first instance, there should be an effort to understand each country and each society and help them overcome obstacles using the laws and institutions of those countries, which in many cases are as good as anywhere in the world. We either believe in our partners or we don't believe. I spent the whole week last week in Montreal and Toronto, together with my colleague, the High Commissioner for Canada in Mozambique, and 9 senior officials from the Ministries of Transport and Communications and Economy and Finance on a study tour of what public-private partnerships are and how Canada has successfully implemented them, and how they could be adapted to Mozambique's conditions at a time when we have huge infrastructure development and foreign direct investment. It was a great learning curve for all those involved, including those who were giving us their experience. Building capacities where they are needed is essential, and it is the way to forge a strong partnership. Both US and Japan have a very well-developed private sector with the best and the highest standards. They are and they will continue to enjoy great returns on their investment in Africa, and Africa will benefit. What we seek, we Africans, is that they uphold the same standards, the private sector, they uphold the same standards in Africa as they do in their home countries, so that even attempts of corruption will fail because they will not accept to bribe anyone for any service. We also want them to go beyond small tokens of corporate social responsibility and become good corporate citizens of the African countries they work in. Some do this very well, but many are still lacking. I would also recommend that Japan and the US work together in strengthening the capabilities of regional economic communities, which are the building blocks of continental integration in Africa. And all of them have organs and mechanisms they have mechanisms to enable peace, stability, democracy, and good governance. They should provide a more robust support to AU peace and security architecture, continue and expand support to gender equality and women empowerment, as well as investment in youth, which is this year's AU theme. Agenda 2063 covers these and other aspirations of Africa, and it represents Africa's ownership, and as such, partnerships should rally around it. I tried to follow my script so that I didn't take so long. I hope I didn't take too long. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, but then we'll throw the floor open to you all to ask questions as well. My first question, Linda, is for you. One of the recommendations we heard was the importance of America and Japan coordinating our approach toward Africa to maximize our strengths. But could you talk a little bit about your experience with the U.S.-Japan strategic dialogue in Africa, and do you think that was an effective way of coordinating our approaches?
Absolutely. We have always felt that there are enough challenges and opportunities on the continent of Africa that we should share with our partners. And it's important that we complement each other and not step on each other or duplicate each other's efforts to deal with the challenges. So the dialogue that we held with the government of Japan to talk about areas of cooperation that we could address together on the continent of Africa, I thought was a great opportunity, not just for us, but also for our Japanese partners. In the areas of security assistance, in the areas of peacekeeping, in the areas of girls' education, these were some of the areas that we've worked. We've also worked with Japan on energy policy. We've worked on humanitarian assistance as well as support for each other's initiatives on the continent of Africa. So I thought it was an extraordinary opportunity for our African partners to get the best from both of us.
Ambassador Kitahara, you made the very good point that Japan's Africa policy is grounded in Japan's own interests. It's good for Japan, and that's obviously a very sustainable policy then. But and you mentioned one reason Africa is so important is because there are 54 nations who each have a vote in the United Nations, so it's important for Japan to have good relations. But could you also comment, another aspect of the United Nations is that the United States and Japan are the two largest donors, or the two largest contributors to the budget, and so therefore we have a very outsized role in the United Nations. But could you maybe talk a little bit more about how the United States and Japan might work at the UN or other international organizations like the World Bank or the IMF or the African Development Bank to advance our interests?
Yes, naturally we are working a lot with all those international institutions, but when it comes to things like security, peacekeeping activity, everything in South Sudan, recently we decided to pull out our troops. It's not always easy for Japan because of the lack of experience to go everywhere in Africa where there are conflicts. But in that sense, we work a lot with the international institutions, especially with the United Nations. And one of the good example might be that, for instance, where we live together in Senegal or in the surrounding countries, there was a lot of threats coming from north to Mali. There was a lot of incidents in Ivory Coast or Burkina Faso. And of course, they are a huge frontier and very, very difficult to control everything. And on top of that, that region was kind of base for the illegal traffic from South America for the drug and firearms, everything. So because Japan cannot, and maybe United States cannot look at every part of this region, we worked a lot with people like UNODC because they have a lot of knowledge, a lot of people in this region to tackle this problem of illegal traffic or whatever. So this is, I guess, for the Japanese government, one of the way to try to be helpful to those issues.
Yeah, Ambassador Kitahara used one acronym, UNODC, which is the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and it was a very important tool for both of us, I think, particularly in our responsibilities in Guinea-Bissau, where we were very concerned about illicit traffic in narcotics, but often it was easier for us to have a UN organization do the training, police training, rather than as an individual country. So I think that was a good example of how a multilateral entity can often be a very useful tool for an individual donor. And I think both United States and Japan were contributing a lot to their work in West Africa. So thank you. My next question actually is for the three of you. The same question I'll ask each of you to address in turn. But I was struck, Dr. Onyango, you mentioned how, in your experience, the development work that Sasakawa has done has been most effective in areas where there's good governance. On the other hand, Ambassador Dos Santos, you mentioned how African partners want to be treated with respect and treated equally, and donors should avoid lecturing or coercion. So how do we, as potential donors in Africa, balance our desire to work with governments who are well-governed, on the one hand, and on the other hand, avoid that trap of being lecturing or coercing governments? It seems like a little bit of a dilemma, but I'm curious how each of you might address that concern. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Pham, with you.
Well, it's a very difficult question, but it's, I think, at the heart of the conundrum that donor countries, partners face when they're looking for effective partners. And speaking for myself, one of the things I would argue is Africa is, as I've mentioned earlier, Africa is not a country. Africa is 54 countries, and of the 54 countries, one can start dividing each of them into regions, some of them along constitutional lines of provinces or states, others into economic and cultural zones. After there's great diversity, and trying to treat everything as the same is a fundamental mistake. And so I think as partners, we should, as the ambassador pointed out correctly, work with partners, but it's also incumbent upon the partners to be effective partners. And I think that's where we have to exercise some judgment and engage partners up to the limit of their capacity. Going beyond that is an unreasonable imposition request. It's not that we should lower standards, but we should move at a pace at which they're, and as my colleagues here have spoken, the aid is most effective when you have a partner, that's when it's sustainable. Now, obviously, situations of dire humanitarian disaster, such as we're seeing in South Sudan, clearly call for something else there. If we wait for that government to get its act together, it's unconscionable what that government is not doing and what it's doing. And we wait for it, hundreds of thousands will starve. Can't. But in most cases, it's partnering appropriately. And that's the key, is calibration and nuance.
Thank you.
Yeah, like he says, when it's humanitarian, the latest, the 17 million famine-stricken because of drought are cut across about 8 countries. Some of it includes even failed states. So clearly, the approach there is different. But when it is like long-term engagement, I think right now it's incumbent on the African countries themselves. I mean, it's not like 20 years ago. We have educated people. We have young people who are demanding better governance. They are comparing their country with the more developed countries, not even with the countries around them. They say when you have a panel, for example, in the USA, they do this. In Japan, they do this. Maybe they should also learn from us. So they are demanding better things for themselves. And so we have to have absorptive capacity. So if you have a donor, yes, we are talking around the table, and this is how we are going to do it. It's not just a question of giving money. It's taxpayers' money. It's not just giving money, and then you don't know what to do with it, and you favor some areas and not others, and you end up not using it. But my appeal was really, and continues to be, and I think Ambassador here said, we have to help capacity build. For those who say no absorptive capacity to use the funds, and some countries are too small, they don't even have people to use those funds, I would like to urge that you continue to invest in capacities. We are also trying to get Africans in the diaspora, to lure them to come back to the continent. But they are not going to come back to no jobs. They are not going to come back to insecurity. They are not going to come back to where children want to go to good schools. And they are not going to come back to where they are going to be discriminated. So we also on the continent have a lot to do to be able to get into this partnership effectively.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Yes, thank you. I think the idea is not to work with governments and condone corruption or protect those who are corrupt leaders. The idea is to engage with countries and societies and work with regional organizations, because they too have regional mechanisms and principles on governance, on corruption. Even some of them, like SADC, have instruments to deal with those cases and work with them and not exclude them, because the result will be that we'll let the situation unravel, and then it becomes a huge catastrophe. And then the international community has to intervene to resolve such a problem. I think if we work as partners, we respect each other, and we advise each other, we identify the weaknesses together, I think we can achieve greater things. For instance, on development aid, there has been a process on the Paris Declaration and then subsequent meetings. There is more or less an internationally agreed formula to deal with development assistance. But now things are changing, and we are going back to the time when aid can only be given if this happens or that doesn't happen. We are forgetting all the process that we have gone through that was building on partnership to a process of carrots and sticks. African countries and African societies, including civil society, have grown up. So we have to give them credit for what they can do for their countries and work with them, help them overcome the obstacles. I think when you have that mindset, you will do things like we are talking about here. And I think we have given some very good recommendations that came out of the different presentations to move forward.
Thank you. Okay, now I'll open the floor up to questions. We have a couple people with microphones. If I could ask people, after you're recognized, to first state your name and your affiliation, and then indicate who you're directing the question to, because we have 5 excellent panelists. And finally, since there's so many people here, if you could keep your questions short to maximize the time available for our panelists to answer. We'll start here in the middle. You have your hand up.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nguyệt Ly. I come from Vietnam. I came here as a Fulbright scholar in American University. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion and information. We very love to hear that because we share a lot of situation of the Africa, because the Vietnam is now the developing country, and we also receive a lot of financial support from the U.S. and also Japan to building the country. The thing I'm very interested in about you all's experience is that I heard about the situation of the corruption in Africa, and also I also learned that the Japan and the United States did a lot of pressure to other countries, even in TPP or in other international agreement, trade agreement, how to deal with and how to tackle with the transparency and corruption. So my question is regarding 2 things. The first, how about the US and Japan to help and to assist the Africa to improve the transparency and to tackle the corruption in Africa? And the second thing is that is there any case or something from the US investor or even the Japanese investor to do with the Africa government, or also they have a trouble with the governance in Africa, and how you all solve the problem? You bring the case to the tribunal international, or you to settle down the dispute between the two? So that's what I'm very interested in. Thank you very much for your time.
Should we start maybe with Dr. Pham, and then we can have others join in?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Let me just tackle the question on transparency. Obviously, modern means of communication really help, from the very basic things to the very complex things with transparency. In a lot of cases where we've seen democratic transitions and open elections, it's because alongside the voter tallies being done, you have volunteers out there using SMS messages to tabulate, so there's no cooking the election results as they go along. When I first got involved in Africa a number of years ago, that was sometimes the books were cooked literally at the polling place and certainly at the tabulation centers. Now you can't really do that as easily anymore because people are sending those results in. That's a very simple thing. It happens during elections. But also there are African solutions, and this is the great ingenuity of Africa. Let me cite just one example, and I'll put there. In Rwanda, for example, there is a national governance board which oversees governance. There puts out an annual report, self-report, critical, and civil officials have a contract that's based on performance. You're the mayor of a town. How many people are you connecting to water or electricity this year? How many kilometers of road are you going to build? At the end of the year, you get a review against these very concrete metrics. You meet your goal, you may get a bonus, you may get a promotion. You don't meet your goal, you may stall. You fail repeatedly, you will look for new employment. And this is something local, not perfect, but it's a start. And there are other examples across the continent where Africans, as my sister was pointing out earlier, are demanding better results. They're not taking it lying down anymore.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and provide another example, in Senegal, where I was posted, there had been a democratic transition. An opposition candidate, Macky Sall, was elected president, and in the process of campaigning, he made a lot of promises to people. That's what politicians do. And there was a civil society organization that has put online what they call a Macky meter. And they've listed every promise he made in the campaign, and then every year he gets a grade on how well he's doing to accomplish his promise. I'm not sure it's a very popular tool in government, but certainly among the people in Senegal, they're very interested in assessing how their president has done. So these kinds of pressures coming up, I think, do contribute to better governance. And so I would agree that there's a lot of ingenuity on the continent of Africa, helping with that. But Linda, did you want to add something?
Just in comparison to your Macky Sall story, similarly in Ghana during the election, the president made a lot of commitments, and civil society has kept all of those commitments, and they've listed them, and they've put them online, and they're tracking his ability to address those commitments. But the broader issue of corruption is a huge problem across the continent of Africa. As people look across the continent, they see how corruption has thwarted the development of the continent, the development of infrastructure, schools, governance, investment. Corruption is really a cancer that will keep countries from moving forward, and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars have been stolen from coffers of governments that should have gone toward building infrastructure. And as we see this huge youth population that is growing, the youth population is questioning governments about their commitments to good governance and their transparency with taxpayer dollars. And that's becoming more and more of an issue. And it's something that we have worked on. We have a corruption initiative that came out of the President's Leaders Summit in 2014, where we're working with governments to address corruptions. We've also been working with some governments and recouping the funds that have been taken and put in bank accounts across the world, and helping them track those funds and get those funds back to their countries. And also, we are working to contribute to justice, to building the capacity of Ministry of Justice in the justice sector to hold people accountable who are involved in corruption. So there are a lot of activities that are going on in that area. Some governments resist it, but many governments are seeing that it's important that they are answerable to their people.
Would someone else like to add a comment on transparency? Or yes?
Corruption is bad. It's killing us. I know it's a worldwide phenomenon, but when it is in a developing country, small economies, it is really bad. It robs people of opportunities. You have the haves who are the ones who are corrupt. They have more and they are even stealing more. And then the majority are just being left there helpless, and there's nothing they can do. So you can have all these institutions, anti-corruption commission, what have you. I think the answer is in what do you do with it once you find out that people actually are guilty, are capable. What do? Do you just let them go and then you create more corrupt people? So I think that's a huge challenge, and I think many countries need help here. And you might wish to target young people. Personally, I work with people on the ground to track what the leaders have said they'll do, to encourage them to vote them out, the power of the vote, In Kenya, we have the power of the vote. We don't know whether it will work this time. And also to actually report and make sure that it is actually taken care of. But then who do you report to when the police themselves are also corrupt? You know, the courts are corrupt. So it's a major, major issue. We know you have it here as well, but to tell you the truth, it is bad on that continent. And so that's an area where you begin to train the young people to track and the citizenry themselves to hold their leaders to account.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. Yes, here at the front table.
Thank you. My name is Kazuhiro Suzuki. I'm the economic minister at the Japanese embassy here. I have a very, very difficult question for Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and also Dr. Pham. What do you think about President Trump and the Trump administration's policy toward Africa? We have only two hints. The only things that we know so far from the public document is the budget. The State Department, USAID, and also State Department contribution and the Department Treasury's contribution to the international organization will be thrashed, maybe 30%, 20%, 10%, we don't know yet. On the other part, DOD, Defense Department will have a 10% rise in their budget. That we don't know yet, but there will be a rise in the Defense Department budget. We know that AFRICOM is very, very active in Africa. So do you have any sense? You know, especially the Ambassador Greenfield has been longest serving senior officials in the transition period as a career diplomat. So probably you have some sense. And then maybe Dr. Pham, you have more latitude to speak freely about the Trump administration. So I really would like to hear both of you. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. It is really not a tough question. I think if we look at the administration and what it has been doing across the board, Africa has not been singled out for budget cuts. The budget cuts have been across the board. And in terms of the administration's policy, I think that's still evolving. Once we have a new assistant secretary on board and senior people in place, and it's again across the board. It's not just the Africa region. Once we see those positions filled, I think we'll start getting a better sense of where the policy is going across the globe. I don't see, again, that Africa has been singled out in any way.
And if I could just jump in here to get back to Dr. Pham's point about how traditionally Africa policy in the United States has had strong bipartisan support. And so that has not changed. And certainly if you look at the Congress, I think there are strong individuals on both parties who want to continue to see the United States remain engaged in Africa.
I don't have very much to add to what Ambassador Thomas Greenfield has said because I think she captured it. I'll just address the second part of your question regarding AFRICOM. AFRICOM is certainly very active on the continent. But having been there literally at its creation and served under the first two commanders on its senior advisory board, a misperception is that it has tremendous resources. Certainly it has resources, but the promise initially was that AFRICOM was started without some of the resources that most of the other regional commands have. And the promise was that when the wars wind down in Iraq and Afghanistan, it would get those resources. The wars ended, but then we hit sequester and went into a budget conversation. So some of those resources are lacking, and there have been various times when it's beg and borrow. So there's still a bit of catch-up to be done. I think the successive commanders, General Ward, General Ham, now General Waldhauser, have done as well as they could with the resources they had. General Rodriguez in between there, but it's still not fully resourced, and so hopefully it's up to Congress to write the legislation. But they'll get the resources. But the other thing I would say is those combatant commanders have repeatedly emphasized, including General Waldhauser, who was here this past week, emphasized also that they are more effective when they have the support and the resources to their civilian counterparts. They've made that, all four of them have been unanimous on that over the years, and I think you continue to hear that from our military officers across, that they need the civilian resources to be there. It makes their job much more easier to manage.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, back here.
Hello? Hi, Dr. Onyango. I wanted to know for how the countries who are dealing with hunger and nutrition, how people are dealing with that on a daily basis. And since it was stated that the population is getting younger in Africa, wouldn't that be an issue in regard to agriculture? Because I'm thinking that as the younger generation will not want to be farmers, they would seek to be skilled laborers. So how do you think that is going to affect Africa going forward? And what will the Japanese connection do to help with hunger and nutrition within those regions that are facing hunger and malnutrition?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thank you. As I said earlier, for the current crisis, and it is a crisis, I think it's the worst hunger situation we have seen in a long time, maybe in 70 years. It is a multinational approach contributing to addressing that issue because it's an emergency and it should be short-lived. But when it comes to longer term, as Sasakawa, we have been there now for more than 30 years on the ground, working not in all the countries, but in the countries where we do, we work with the governments and ministries of agriculture for sustainability. And we know it's a way that works, and we train people, extension workers. We work with very senior decision makers, and some of the ones we train actually become senior decision makers. And we see universities are involved as well, and we see that is actually working well. And when it comes to the food and nutrition, we address our whole value chain. Now, when it comes to the young people across the continent, I can tell you, I normally say that agriculture provides the best job opportunity right now for young people. And it's not agriculture that you go to dig with a hoe. We are talking of using modern technology, mechanization, if it is small mechanization, young people having an opportunity to lease land and also work along the value chain, and it's not necessarily on the farm. And so it's a question of redefining what we mean by agriculture. And so the food sector, if you take a region like ECOWAS in Western Africa, or SADC in Southern Africa, or East Africa, the biggest traded commodity is food. And it requires the whole value chain, how to grow it, increase yields, storage, transport, value addition, and all that. So there is a lot of opportunity, and using IT. So it's up to us to make sure governments, many of them right now, have the youth agenda, and it's youth within the agricultural value chain, and all of us NGOs as well. A lot of training. I know the US is involved a lot through USAID, Feed the Future, in creating platforms to show how young people can be involved without necessarily resorting to old practices of their parents and grandparents. So there are many opportunities there, yeah.
And if I could just jump in on opportunities in agriculture, I know another area is private investment coming in in agriculture. Yeah. Maybe Ambassador Kitahara, do you want to talk a little bit about the investments of companies like Kagome in Senegal, just as an example of this sort of opportunities?
You mentioned, of course, we have, Japan is doing a lot of things, and for the emergent cases, of course, we just supply, food and canned food, etc. But also now, there's a lot of Japanese private sector company who are showing interest in doing the agriculture business in Africa. And in case of Senegal, where we stayed for 3 years, actually there's I don't know if you know the company Kagome, it's equivalent to American Heinz for ketchup. So they are producing, they will start producing tomato in Senegal. And then after that, with the tomato, they are going to produce the paste that they will export to the whole ECOWAS. And then afterwards, their target is to produce, the small ketchup that are used in the shops like McDonald's or those kind of fast food restaurants. So there are those companies who are having a big kind of picture to come to the western part of Africa to promote their business.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of those companies, it's not just the dollars invested, but it's the technology they bring and the know-how and the linkage back to the international climate. So it's an exciting development in the area of agriculture, I think. I think we have time for about 2 more questions. I think there was one over here, the lady right here in front of the mirror. And then we'll take one more over here.
Thank you. My question is to the panel in general. Having just completed some assignment with the State Department in Southern Africa and now preparing for another assignment going to Japan, I'm very caught up in the intersection between Japan and the US and Africa and the countries in Africa. My question concerns the youth demographic, and I know we addressed it a little bit in terms of agriculture, but I'd like to expand that thought a little bit. Struck by the demographic of half of the populations across Africa being that youth demographic under 19, age 19, and the reality that the US and Japan are dealing with aging society issues. Should we not be thinking more about channeling more development assistance to a younger demographic across Africa and across our development assistance programs? It seems to me that there's a lot of activity that's going on. I don't know that the activity that as it exists, in the forms that it exists, targets that youth demographic. I would certainly, based on my limited experience, second, the need to really target that youth demographic that does not feel that it has time to wait for generations of elderly leadership to pass before the baton gets handed to them, but are looking for opportunities right now. Is there more that we could be doing for that youth demographic, and if so, how so? Thank you.
Who would like to, you want to take a crack at that?
Let me just start, and I absolutely agree with you that our programs have to be targeted toward this population. And one of the programs that we have engaged over the last 4 years is the Young African Leaders Initiative, which people remind us every day is a drop in the bucket. But actually, that drop in the bucket has had a huge impact across the continent, with only about 2,000 people with the 1,000 who are coming to the United States this summer. We have about 400,000, if not more, on the YALI network. And that network has expanded across the continent of Africa. And there are regional centers in 4 countries on the continent that are bringing additional young people to provide them training in leadership in 4 key areas. And it's public service, it's entrepreneurship, it's energy, and it's civil society. And this has had a huge, huge impact across the continent. Also, education programs that are focusing on training so that these young people are not just educated in universities, but they are getting training in skills, and programs that are focusing on young women to bring them into the workforce. So I think as we start to look in the future at these programs, more and more of them will focus on youth. And I think governments in Africa have realized that they too have to focus on this youth population. And again, they don't have to wait because their populations, their leaders are aging as well, and young people have to be prepared to step into their shoes sooner rather than later.
Someone else want to address that as well? Yes.
Yes, I guess this is a most important issue, and we, as a Japanese government, we already have only in Senegal 2 big vocational training center for boys and girls, and we are inviting every year thousands of young people to Japan for the education. And quite recently, in the activity of TICAD, our Prime Minister started an initiative named Abe Initiative. It's African Business Education. And those are people who are aged more than 20 to 30, to give them really more business education. But on top of all this, I think, people tend to think that those vocational trainings are very important for the country to develop from the industry, etc. But personally, the difficulty in some of the African countries is that when they are small, they learn in their own language. And at the age of 5 or 6, they go to the school. For instance, in Senegal, it's a French-based school. So all of a sudden, they start learning in French, everything, mathematics, history, I don't know what, but in French, that they don't speak at all. And this is a very basic, very important thing. And I think countries, whether European countries, Japan, or United States of America should really look at this, how to implement the real basic education. That is something I really felt during my stay in Africa.
Thank you. Before we get over here, I think there was right behind Karen, there was another person. Yeah, raise your hand, stand up. Okay, you can ask your question, then we'll go over here.
Thank you. I am Zoe from PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and thank you very much for a very informative discussion. My question is related to, is more of a comparative one, and I wonder, could the panelists share your view about what distinguishes Japan's approach of engaging Africa different from the Chinese experience, especially when it comes to
Japan's approach versus China's approach to Africa.
Yes, exactly, and especially when it comes to investment. And a second question is about whether we know that enlarged foreign investment is part of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's economic strategy or Abenomics. And I wonder, what are the domestic incentives, or is there any government support for domestic Japanese private companies going to Africa? Thank you.
So the first question for
comparing Japan and China's approaches.
Of course, now there's a lot of competition between. It is said that there are a lot of competition between Japan, China, and India now as well. Now I speak as a man who worked for almost 40 years in the private sector rather than a diplomat. For me, actually, there's not so much competition because we are working in the different field. Japan cannot compete anymore with China in constructing a road or things like that. We are more concentrating on something different, like very high-end technology, power generation. And but for that, even for that, we start losing competitivity working only with the Japanese companies. So when I was in London for three years, I concluded contract for 3,000 megawatt power generation in Africa. And for among the 3,000 megawatt, maybe half of that, I used the Korean subcontractor. And now, afterwards, I think we already started using Chinese subcontractor for building power generation or whatever. So things are starting and changing day by day. So it's not only simple competition. For instance, even I guess Toyota is not really fighting directly with a Chinese car. It's a different segment of market. So we are working a lot with Indian companies, joint venture in Africa, or for the project that includes civil work. We work also a lot with Turkish companies, Egyptian companies, and of course with European companies. So we don't look necessarily like this to competition with the Chinese company, but maybe the government is looking very like this. They are very cautious, and they always say about competition with China. But the private sector, no, they are just case by case, doing best business with the best partner. And the second question was?
Is there government support for the private sector to invest in?
Yes and no, I guess. We need a lot of governmental support. For instance, that happened quite recently with Mozambique. We exchanged the investment treaty because the Japanese company actually has a huge project of investment, many of them to Mozambique. So in that sense, it is quite helpful, and we definitely need the support from the Japanese government to create an equal basis with other countries' private companies. But when it comes to really searching, studying, trying to put in place a concrete project, then, excuse me, Suzuki-san, but he already left. I don't think private company needs much the help from the government.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hey, Joe, and just speaking as an analyst, to answer your question, your compare and contrast question on Japan, I would say on the level of assistance, official development assistance, there is no comparison. Japan is extraordinarily generous, not only in its contributions to the UN efforts, but in direct bilateral and regional. And on the Chinese side, although there has been a small uptick in recent years, there's no comparison. There's credits extended through banks and other lending, but actual development assistance is fairly negligible. The second point I would make is also, and it's a matter of national, if you will, pardon me, style or culture. Japan's efforts, I think one of the challenges, with all due respect, Japan has is its efforts are not as well known because I think there's a natural modesty. And I won't talk about other people's cultures, but there's some cultures that, you give away, a carton of something and there's a press release with the carton. And there are others who are getting data, and I've been my first research piece on Japan's Africa policy was probably now 9 or 10 years old. But excavating that data was not easy, and so I think there's a difference, and I would respectfully, even if it goes against nature or against preferences to our Japanese friends, that perhaps a little bit of, if not both, a little bit greater awareness could be helped strategically on the political level.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question over here.
Thank you. My name is Kunio Kikuchi, a former World Banker, and I'm with the Washington Research and Analysis. A couple of questioners here, and a number of you have already mentioned this huge bulge of youth happening in Africa, and that by 2050, that the population would even double from where it is now. And I'm just struck by the lack of sense of urgency to address that matter. You have addressed what to do about the current bulge and youth unemployment, etc. But by 2050, there'll be as many youth and more than there are today. Additionally, plus in another 15 more years after that, there'll be an entire billion additional people to the 3 billion that you, 2 billion that you already mentioned. So what specifically, shouldn't there be more urgency on how to address this population issue? Should you not leave some room for the mountain gorillas in Burundi and Rwanda instead of just covering the whole place with humanity? And to Mr. Ambassador Kitahara, I'd say that isn't Japan giving the wrong message to other countries when the government continually touts or states that stable population and even slightly declining population that we are enjoying in Japan is a negative economic situation and we must do something about increasing population? Thank you.
Shall I start?
Sure, please.
Okay. Look, no one is ignoring the population growth problem across Africa. I think it's on everybody's agenda, and there are a number of root causes. It's not just population control, but it's also education. And when people are better educated, they have fewer, when women are better educated, they have fewer children because they understand the importance of not having as many children. There are a lot of cultural reasons why people have so many children, and addressing those cultural reasons, I think, is something that is on our agenda, that civil society and all of our programs have worked to address. The answer is not a short-term answer. The resolution is not short-term. It's very much a long-term process of changing people's behaviors and changing practices that encourage families to have, to encourage people to have large families. And that's, again, going to take a tremendous amount of work. Even in our own culture, I'm the oldest of 8 children. I have 2. And all of my brothers and sisters only have 1 or 2. Because we now know that it's not cost effective to have 8 children. And I think that's going to become more and more the case on the continent of Africa as well.
Would you like to, yes, address that issue?
Well, I just wanted to say that on the part of the African continent, this is definitely a very important and urgent matter. That's why it's part of the this year's theme to look at what can be done, and also with the involvement of the youth themselves, because older people think differently from the young people. They deal with technology in ways that we don't know how, and they see things differently, and their involvement is very helpful to devise strategies for the future. And I think not all young people can be business people, so focus has to be on skills training for them to be able to get a job, but to help themselves create a job, not as a business, but to do something that can sustain themselves. That's why the training institutions for apprenticeship is very important, and things like that. And we're doing that with the US and with Japan. And the other point which was raised on the language, I think it's you, Ambassador, who raised that issue on the language. We actually have a program with USAID in Mozambique. They have contracted an organization called Creative from here, from the US, that is going to deal exactly with that. How can we develop teaching of local language, African languages in the country, in schools? And they're starting with pilot projects, and then they'll spread out. It has proven to be a very important thing when a child can grow up. I started primary school without speaking Portuguese, which is the mode of instruction in Mozambique. And I started only when I went to school, primary education, about 6 years. So if you can use your own language as well as Portuguese, your possibilities are much greater. Maybe I'll be more than ambassador today.
Well, thank you very much. I've promised we're going to get Dr. Onyango down to her taxi and out to the airport, so we'll stop here. But can we give a round of applause to all of our panelists? Again, I wanted to thank all of you for coming to this Sasakau event. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in U.S., Japan, and Africa. I agree with Dr. Pham. It's a nice triangle, and we need to reinforce all three legs. So thank you very much.